It was a dark night, and I was lying in my bed at Graceland, the mansion I once called my kingdom. My body ached with every breath, and my mind wandered through a maze of pain and confusion. I was Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, but at that moment I felt like a ghost haunting the very place that once brought me glory. The room was quiet, but my thoughts were a storm. I could hear the soft hum of the machines around me and the faint whispers of the Memphis Mafia, my loyal crew who never left my side. They were worried, and so was I. My health had been a silent killer, slowly chipping away at the man I used to be. Jerry Schilling, one of my closest friends, had confronted me a few days ago. He was angry, and I could see the concern in his eyes. "God admit, when you fucking guys get your medical degree, then you can tell my doctors what to do." I snapped at him, but deep down I knew he was right. I had been in bed for what felt like an eternity, and my body was a mess. My colon issues were getting worse, and the lack of nutrients and physical activity only made things harder. Dr. Nick, my trusted doctor, kept telling me I needed to get moving, but I couldn't find the strength. The last time I felt good was back in Memphis, when I was taking care of myself. Jerry reminded me of those days, when we were having fun and I was eating right. "All I know, Elvis, is when we were back in Memphis last year, after you got out of the hospital, you were eating right and looking and feeling good, and we were really having fun," he said. But those days felt like a distant memory. When I went back to Memphis, Dr. Nick tried to convince me to get a liver test. My body was swollen, and my hands and feet were so bloated, I couldn't even zip up my boots. I ignored his advice, but the truth was, I was scared. I didn't want to know what was wrong. I had always been the strong one, the one who could handle anything, but now I felt weak and vulnerable. The world outside Graceland was a different story. People were talking, and not in a good way. The tabloids were brutal, calling me fat and 40. Johnny Carson poked fun at me on his show, and even People magazine couldn't resist a jab. The voice tends to be croony where it used to be raunchy, and his lame bodysuits paunch out in some different places. They wrote it hurt, but I tried to ignore it. I was 40, and in 1975, that was considered old for a rock star. But it wasn't just the age. It was the fact that I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing control. My girlfriend, Barbara Lee, saw me for the last time in the fall of 1974. She couldn't believe how much I had changed. The last time we spent the night together was in the fall of 1974. He was grossly overweight, and his once beautiful face was terribly swollen, she later said. In just 4 short years, Elvis had aged physically by at least 20 years. It was a harsh reality, and I couldn't deny it. My birthday that year was a quiet affair. No grand celebrations, no fans, just me and my thoughts. I spent the day in my room, reflecting on the past and dreading the future. Joe Esposito, my road manager, tried to make light of it, but I could see the worry in his eyes. 40 was a big turning point, and that bothered him, he later told the press. There was a picture on a magazine cover, it was Life or Look, that said, "Fat and 40, happy birthday Fat and 40 Elvis." And that's a horrible thing to say about anybody, and that got to him. But the real trouble started a few weeks after my birthday. I was back at Baptist Memorial Hospital, and this time it was serious. My breathing was labored, and the doctors found Demerol in my system. They said it was my liver, but I knew it was more than that. My colon was pushing against my lungs, making it hard to breathe. Dr. Nick performed a liver biopsy, and I had to lie flat on my back for 24 hours. Linda Thompson, my girlfriend at the time, was there with me. She said the test came back negative for cancer, but it was clear that something was wrong. The hospital stay was a wake-up call. I had to go through detox again, and it was hard. Dr. Nick didn't think I was an addict, but I knew I was in trouble. I couldn't be trusted with even a week's supply of medication, so Nurse Tish took control. She prepared 3 daily packets of medication for me, and I had to take them under her watchful eye. It was humbling, but I needed the help. When I got back to Graceland, I tried to turn things around. I started playing racquetball, a new hobby that Dr. Nick and Nurse Tish encouraged. I even built my own court on the grounds. It was a small step, but it felt good to be active again. I also renewed my passion for karate, something I had loved since I was a kid. but the demands of my career were relentless. I played more shows, and the pressure was intense. I made inappropriate remarks on stage, and I embarrassed my band. Duke Bardwell, the bass player, walked away. "I didn't like seeing what was happening to Elvis," he said, and he obviously was just making fun of me to be mean. The strain, with the Colonel, was reaching a breaking point. He was in debt, and he needed me to keep playing in Vegas. "Look, damn it, I'll play this town till I die," I told Lamar Fike. "That old Sonafabich owes so much money that they own him, and they're trying to own me." The next Vegas engagement was a disaster. I had to make an emergency landing on the way there, because I was having trouble breathing. When I got on stage, I was exhausted and in poor shape. I even laid down to sing, and I begged the Colonel to cancel the shows. He refused, and I had to go through with it. By the time the engagement was over, I was back in the hospital. I was falling apart, and I knew it, but I also knew that I had to fight. I had to find a way to get back on my feet, to be the man I once was. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but I wasn't ready to give up, not yet. Elvis's health was getting worse, but he couldn't stop performing. He had high cholesterol, high blood pressure, and was really tired all the time because his adrenal glands weren't working right. His breathing was also getting harder, which worried everyone, especially Dr. Nick. Elvis's voice was at risk, and his belly was swollen, making it tough to breathe. Dr. Nick called in lung specialists, and they found out Elvis might have a lung disease called COPD. But it wasn't just that. Elvis also had a really big colon pushing into his chest, making it even harder to breathe. The doctors thought it might be because of a rare disease called alpha-1 antitrypsin. Dr. Nick and the nurses tried to help Elvis, but he refused to go to Johns Hopkins for more tests. He didn't want anyone to see him as weak. His colon problems were getting worse, and he sometimes had accidents on stage. Dr. Nash, a surgeon, was consulted, but Elvis didn't want any major surgery, even if it might save his life. When Elvis left the hospital, he knew he had more problems than when he went in. Dr. Nick arranged for nurses to help at Graceland. Elvis took his medicine and had his blood pressure checked regularly. He didn't perform again until December, when he made up for the canceled shows in Vegas. Elvis was dealing with a lot of pain. He was still upset about his divorce, the loss of the A Star Is Born project, and not being able to tour overseas. His health was failing, but he didn't want to admit it. He was still Elvis Presley, and he didn't want to show any weakness. The Lisa Marie, his new airplane, gave him a sense of freedom. He could travel whenever he wanted, and it made him feel like a rock star again. Even though he was on a lot of medication, he didn't drink, and he didn't like others drinking much either. The plane was stocked with Tootsie Roll Pops, bubble gum, and Pepsi. The plane was expensive to run, and it added to his financial stress. But it also gave him a way to escape his problems, even if just for a little while. Elvis's relationship with his pilots was special. He treated them with respect, and even invited them to his shows. He wanted to tour overseas, but the Colonel always said no. Some people thought it was because of security concerns, but others believed it was because Elvis wouldn't give up his guns and pills. The Colonel's citizenship issues might have also played a role. Whatever the reason, Elvis never got to perform overseas, and it was a dream he never fulfilled. The Lisa Marie made it harder for Elvis to stop touring. He had to keep performing to cover the plane's costs and his other expenses. Even though he knew he was sick, he felt he had to keep going. In 1975, he played 108 concerts, and on New Year's Eve, he broke a record at the Silverdome in Pontiac, Michigan. Over 62,000 people came to see him, and he earned $800,000, which was the most any entertainer had made at that time. In 1976, Elvis pushed for even more shows, 129 in total. He knew he had to keep performing to pay for everything, but his health was getting worse. He had copped colon problems, adrenal issues, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, arthritis, and glaucoma. Everyone around him could see that more shows meant more medicine, but no one thought he would ever stop. Elvis was determined to keep going, no matter what. I remember the year 1976 as a tough one for Elvis. Health issues, and constant touring were taking a toll on him. Joe Esposito, Elvis's road manager, told me that vacations helped Elvis a lot. We would go to Aspen, and he wouldn't take any pills, and he was great. We had a great time, Joe recalled. But money was a big problem, and taking vacations or buying cars for Denver policemen didn't solve it. Elvis had to keep working to pay his bills and keep a lot of people employed. Lamar Fike, a member of the Memphis Mafia, said, Elvis had a payroll that was phenomenal, and he had to keep a lot of people employed. The tours started in March, and hardly slowed down until the end of the year. There were 9 tours, plus performances in Tahoe and Vegas. By the end of the year, almost all the old crew was replaced with younger guys, and musicians were either quitting or threatening to quit. A new contract between Elvis and Colonel Parker was signed, splitting concert income 50-50. Before, it was a 2/3, 1/3 split. The Colonel wanted to wait before implementing the new deal until Elvis was back on his feet financially, which meant touring nonstop. Elvis recorded at Graceland for the first time in almost a year. RCA brought a recording truck to him, and the Jungle Room sessions began. The den, with its shag carpet on the floor and ceiling, was perfect for a makeshift studio. Elvis recorded songs like She Thinks I Still Care, The Last Farewell, For the Heart, and Moody Blue. The first tour was only 6 days long, and included 4 cities with 8 performances. By the last show in St. Louis, Elvis seemed weak, and the reviews reflected that. The second tour hit 7 cities in 7 days, and Elvis performed 8 shows. He had congestion and breathing issues, and people around him kept saying he was tired. Ronnie Tutt, the drummer, said, There were nights he was so tired or so down, I felt like I had to physically hit the drums much harder than I had before. Cousin Billy Smith said, He was so tired that just about anything exhausted him. Elvis had adrenal insufficiency, which made touring nearly impossible. Without his adrenal glands working, he had no energy. He needed medication to function. Nurse Tish said, Yes, he knew it, absolutely. But it was also starting to look like he couldn't be Elvis with the medication either. He would take more pills, thinking it would make him feel better faster. Background singer Kathy Westmoreland said, He would over-medicate himself. His idea was that if 1 pill was good, 2 were better. He was very ill in the 70s. When Lamar Fike told Elvis he needed to stop taking the drugs, Elvis replied, I need them. Lamar saw it as the hopeless mantra of a drug addict. Elvis had multiple serious health problems and developed a serious prescription medication problem. People around him could only see one or the other. Elvis didn't want to appear weak or broken. He was the boss. Dr. Nick had 2 medication protocols for Elvis, one for on tour and one for at home. The on-tour protocol included a series of stages with different medications at specific times. Stage 1 was at 3 p.m. with a voice shot, vitamins, meds for dizziness, a laxative, appetite suppressants, and testosterone. An hour before the performance, he would get another voice shot, meds for vertigo, a decongestant with codeine, an amphetamine, and sometimes Dilaudid. Moments before the show, he would take caffeine, Dexedrine, and Dilaudid. Right after the performance, he would take a pill for lowering blood pressure, an antihistamine, a strong sedative, and Demerol. At bedtime, he would take Quaalude, Placidil, an amphetamine, a laxative, a blood pressure pill, and 3 other sedatives. If he was restless, he might take more Quaaludes and Amytal. Elvis needed physical rest and rejuvenation, but he was incapable of unmedicated sleep. Dr. Nick tried to adjust the medications, so Elvis could sleep soundly. Insomniacs often sleep for 4 hours, and then need more medication to go back to sleep for 4 more hours. Dr. Nick used various drugs to help Elvis sleep, but they were strong and addictive, and Elvis needed larger doses over time due to built-up tolerance. Elvis had disorders and diseases in 9 of the 11 main systems in the human body. His heart, lungs, and bowels required medication. His adrenal gland failure and low testosterone were issues of the endocrine system. His immune system was compromised, and his urinary system was not functioning properly. His arthritis caused severe pain throughout his body. Sonny West blamed prescription medication addiction for Elvis's poor health, but Elvis had many health issues long before the drug use. In the last year of his life was Elvis dying from prescription drug abuse, his health issues, or the constant touring. Dr. Nick struggled to maintain a drug protocol to treat Elvis's ailments, while also balancing their personal and professional relationship. It became more complicated when Dr. Nick realized that if he didn't give Elvis the medications he thought he needed, Elvis would find another doctor to give them to him. Tour after tour, the reviews were the same. Elvis looked tired and seemed confused. There were good shows, but overall, he was going through the motions. The entourage often wondered if the show should be canceled because of his condition, but Elvis would say, "Just get me to the damn city, and I'll take care of the rest of it." He would emerge from the dressing room ready to go, but sometimes fumbled the words to songs. Larry Geller, Elvis's hairdresser, rejoined the entourage in 1976. The Colonel, who had demanded Elvis stop exploring spirituality in the 1960s, now supported it if it made Elvis happy and helped the show go on. Larry noticed how labored Elvis's breathing had become, even when sitting down. During the Tahoe engagement, Elvis used an oxygen tank backstage to catch his breath between songs. He was losing touch with his voice, the one thing he could always count on. Controlling Elvis's blood pressure during tours was challenging. Stress would raise his blood pressure to dangerous levels, and everyone was concerned about the possibility of a heart attack. Elvis would tell Charlie Hodge, "I'm almost exhausted," halfway through a performance. He still had to finish the show and then get his blood pressure back down to a normal range. Legal issues also weighed on Elvis. The guys were being too rough with fans, and lawsuits were pending. After an incident, Vernon fired Red West, Sonny West, and Dave Hebler, who decided to write a tell-all book about Elvis's private life and drug use. The thought of the book weighed heavily on Elvis for months. Elvis's relationship with Dr. Nick grew more complicated. Elvis was hard to say no to, and being friends with the most famous guy on earth was hard to walk away from. They had a failed business partnership and a personal loan for $200,000 to build a new house. When the sixth tour of 1976 began, Dr. Nick stayed in Memphis because of their strained relationship. Dr. Gainham went instead, but everyone had concerns about his habit of giving Elvis anything he wanted. After the first show, Tish called Dr. Nick with concerns about the medical treatment Elvis was receiving. The Houston show was described as depressingly incoherent, and the Colonel needed to do damage control. Dr. Nick agreed to join the tour in Mobile, Alabama, and discovered that Dr. Gainham had given Elvis drugs that caused his blood pressure to plummet and disrupted showtimes. Dr. Nick believed Elvis was given Sperrine and Donadel, which impacted his performance. At the Houston show, Dr. Nick said, "What you are seeing are drug side effects and not a drug addict." I remember Dr. Nick as the one who tried to help Elvis more than the other doctors. Elvis trusted him, even though Dr. Nick wasn't always just a doctor to him. He was also a friend, and sometimes that line got blurry. Dr. Nick would write prescriptions for what Elvis wanted, but he also tried to control the amount of medication Elvis took. He was the only doctor who tried to keep things in check. Elvis was in a lot of pain from his back and neck, and he often felt sick. Dr. Nick was the one who would admit Elvis to the hospital when things got really bad. He'd even get Elvis detoxed when necessary. Dr. Nick tried to figure out what was really wrong with Elvis, not just treat the symptoms. He wanted to help Elvis get better, not just feel better for a little while. By 1976, Elvis was really worn out. Dr. Nick kept telling the Colonel, who managed Elvis's tours, that the schedule was too much. Elvis was so tired, he had to have his backup singers do solos in the middle of shows, just to catch his breath. Dr. Nick even told the Colonel in front of Elvis that the tour schedule was insane. It was clear that Elvis needed a break, but the tours kept going. Elvis's health was getting worse, and it was obvious to everyone around him. He would confide in people like Kathy Westmoreland and Larry Geller, telling them about his pain and how he just wanted to function. Despite everything, Elvis was still trying to push through. He believed he could handle anything like a superhero. Elvis's personal life was also complicated. He had a new girlfriend, Ginger Alden, who was much younger than him. Some people thought she was too young and inexperienced to handle being with someone as famous and sick as Elvis. Ginger sometimes didn't want to travel with Elvis, which upset him. He was already in a lot of pain and dealing with a lot of stress. In 1977, Elvis went on a few more tours, but they were exhausting. He would start out with some energy, but by the end, he was in so much pain he couldn't even perform. One tour had to be canceled because Elvis was in too much pain. He was admitted to the hospital again, and even though he tried to rest, he kept going back on tour. It was like his body could no longer keep up with the demands of the shows. Elvis's last tour was in June 1977. He gave it his all, but it was clear he was struggling. His voice wasn't as strong, and he sometimes had to leave the stage during the shows. Even so, his last concert in Indianapolis was thought to be one of his best in months. He gave everything he had left. When Elvis got home, he spent time with his daughter, Lisa Marie, and his cousin Billy. He looked a lot like his dad did before he died, with a swollen stomach and a lot of pain. People close to him, like Kathy Westmoreland and Lamar Fike, begged him to cancel the next tour. They knew he was too sick to keep going. But Elvis felt responsible for the people who depended on him for work. He said he had to keep working to pay the bills. On August 15, 1977, Elvis had a dentist appointment. He got some codeine pills for pain, even though he didn't really need them. That night, he played racquetball with Billy and Ginger, and he sang a song at the court. It was the last time he ever sang. Before going to bed, Elvis told Billy that he was going to have his best tour ever. Little did he know, it would be his last night. Billy Smith left Elvis' room around 7:45. It was time for Elvis to go to bed, but it was more complicated than that. Elvis couldn't just fall asleep like most people. He needed special help. Dr. Nick or Nurse Tish would prepare his medication in advance, usually in 2 packets. Sometimes, if he still couldn't sleep, he'd ask for a 3rd packet. Elvis took the first packet at 6 a.m. and the second one about an hour and a half later, just before Billy left. But he still couldn't sleep, and he was worried about getting enough rest before the next day's tour. So he asked for a 3rd packet, which included 2 more pills and some placebos. He told Ginger he was still awake and went to the bathroom with a book. Not long after, Elvis had a heart attack. He managed to stand up, take a couple of steps, and then he fell. Ginger woke up around 2 p.m. and went to check on him. She found him on the bathroom floor, unresponsive. Joe Esposito, Elvis' road manager, tried to revive him, but it was too late. Elvis' body was already stiff, cold, and blue. His jaw was locked, and they couldn't even perform CPR properly. The ambulance took him to Baptist Memorial Hospital, where he was officially pronounced dead at 3:30 p.m., even though he had probably died hours earlier. The autopsy was done privately, as the family requested, but that only led to more rumors and conspiracy theories. The Colonel, Elvis' manager, was in Maine getting ready for the tour when he got the news. He paused for a moment, then started organizing everything. The tour was supposed to start soon, and everyone was already on their way to Maine. Joe Esposito sent someone to California to pick up Priscilla and Lisa Marie, and he helped with travel arrangements for others, like ex-girlfriend Linda Thompson. Lisa Marie, who was only 9 at the time, was in Memphis and didn't understand what was happening. Joe reassured Priscilla, "She's okay, she's with Grandma." Everyone at Graceland was in shock. Even though they had seen Elvis struggle, they never thought he would die so young. Cousin Harold Lloyd remembered the last time he saw Elvis, just hours before, when he was in good spirits after a dentist appointment. Billy Smith, who had played racquetball with Elvis earlier, couldn't believe it. "I thought it can't happen to him, he's too great." Funeral preparations began right away. Joe Esposito and the Colonel made sure everything was done according to Vernon's wishes. They chose the same funeral home that had handled Gladys' funeral years earlier. They even found a copper casket, just like the one Gladys was buried in. The funeral director, Robert Kendall, managed to get 17 white Cadillac limousines for the procession, even though there were only 3 in the state. Elvis was brought back to Graceland to lie in state. Fans lined up to pay their respects, and the crowd outside the gates grew to over 30,000 people. It was nearly 100 degrees, and many fans needed medical attention. Priscilla and Lisa Marie said their private goodbyes that evening, placing a sterling silver bracelet on Elvis' wrist. The next morning, the funeral was held in the living room. Friends and family, including James Brown, George Hamilton, and Anne Margaret, were there. Reverend Rex Humbard spoke about Elvis' generosity. and several gospel songs were performed. The pallbearers, including Joe Esposito, Charlie Hodge, and Dr. Nick, carried Elvis to his final resting place at Forest Hills Cemetery. After the funeral, the financial situation became a concern. Elvis had spent a lot of money, and there was only about $1 million left in his account. The Colonel presented Vernon with a contract to continue representing Elvis' image and products, ensuring that the money would keep coming in. This move would help Vernon keep Graceland, but it also meant that the Colonel would continue to profit from Elvis' legacy. By October, Elvis and his mother, Gladys, were reburied in the meditation garden at Graceland due to concerns about vandalism and potential grave robbing. The garden, which Elvis had built as a peaceful retreat, became his final resting place. Vernon, Grandma, and Aunt Delta continued to live at Graceland until their deaths. Vernon passed away in 1979, and Grandma in 1980. They were both buried in the meditation garden with Elvis and Gladys. After Elvis died, many of his friends and staff had to find new directions in life. Some had already started side careers, but others had to start from scratch. Lamar Fike, who had been with Elvis from the beginning, felt a void that could never be filled. Essentially, Elvis' death messed up everybody's life. Most of us weren't trained to do anything but look after him, he said. Cousin Billy Smith also struggled. He had been living in a trailer behind Graceland, but Vernon wouldn't let him keep it after Elvis died. Billy and his family had to start over with nothing. Dr. Nick, who had been Elvis' doctor for years, had to face legal troubles. He was indicted for overprescribing to several patients, including Elvis. The trial was tough, but he was found not guilty because the jury believed he was trying to help his patients. However, his medical license was eventually revoked in 1993. Despite the controversy, many of Elvis' friends, like Billy Smith, still believed Dr. Nick had done his best. Dr. Nick tried to help Elvis. Elvis was a strong-willed person, and he did what he wanted, Billy said. Elvis' death changed everything, not just for his family and friends, but for the world. The king of rock and roll was gone, but his legacy lived on. Dr. Forrest Tennant, who was a witness for the defense, believed Elvis was just trying to treat his pain. He really was trying to treat himself, in my opinion, Dr. Tennant said. Today, Elvis would be called a fibromyalgia patient. He added, pain therapy didn't exist back then. Dr. Nick, Elvis's doctor, did the best he could. Attorney James F. Neal even said that without Dr. Nick, Elvis would have died 10 years earlier. Dr. Nick was the only one who investigated and treated Elvis's ailments, while the other doctors just prescribed medication. Dr. Nick's son, Dean Nishapoulos, told me that his dad went out of his way to help Elvis. He would get calls at all hours of the night and spend a lot of time thinking about what he could do to help. Dean also mentioned that if his dad had better tools, like an MRI machine, things might have been different. Dad was doing pain management before pain management was even a thing, Dean said. People started speculating about Elvis's death right after the cause was announced as cardiac arrhythmia, which means his heart stopped. The question was, what caused the arrhythmia? Oddly, the medical examiner, Dr. Jerry Francisco, made the announcement even though the autopsy was still going on. Dan Warlick, an investigator for the medical examiner's office, found no signs of typical drug use during the autopsy. There were no needle tracks or signs of cocaine use. The autopsy revealed that all of Elvis's abdominal organs were unusually large. His spleen weighed 340 grams, which is about 4 times the normal weight. His kidneys were also large, but seemed to be in good shape. Elvis's liver was twice the size of a normal one and wasn't in great shape, but it wasn't the cause of death. When they removed his heart, it was described as looking like brown flab instead of red muscle. A normal heart weighs about 375 grams, but Elvis's heart weighed 520 grams. This suggested he had high blood pressure and possibly congestive heart failure. The autopsy also found that Elvis's colon was shockingly large and packed with fecal material. It was up to 5 inches in diameter and 8 to 9 feet long. The colon was filled with barium, a substance used for X-rays, which had been there for months because of his severe constipation. Dr. Nick said that Elvis had been dealing with constipation since he was a child, and it wasn't caused by drugs. The doctors at the autopsy didn't know this, and assumed the colon issues were due to drug abuse. The autopsy also revealed that Elvis had low levels of certain immune system proteins, which suggested he had a chronic disease. He also had a genetic condition called alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, which can affect the lungs and liver. These findings were largely dismissed at the time, but they might have explained some of Elvis's health issues. The toxicology reports from 2 different labs presented different opinions. One lab in California found 10 drugs in Elvis's system and believed they caused his death through polypharmacy, which is the use of multiple drugs. The other lab in Utah found 11 drugs, but believed they were all for medical treatment and within therapeutic ranges. The medical examiner, Dr. Francisco, agreed with the Utah lab, saying Elvis would have died even without the drug. When Elvis's drug use became public, people started asking more questions. In 1979, ABC 2020 did a report called The Elvis Cover-Up. The host, Geraldo Rivera, interviewed people at the autopsy and suggested a cover-up. However, the autopsy was a private medical record requested by the Presley family. The show didn't explain this, leading many to believe there was a cover-up involving the hospital. The pathologist who removed Elvis's colon assumed the colon issues were due to drug abuse, but he didn't know about Elvis's lifelong constipation. The show also didn't discuss Elvis's medical history or his family's health issues. If they had known about his mother, uncles, and their health problems, they might have seen a pattern of heart and liver issues. The toxicology report was presented in a way that made it seem like Elvis was a drug addict, without explaining that many of the drugs were for medical reasons. The Utah lab's findings, which said the drugs were therapeutic, were not mentioned. The 2020 show changed how people felt about Elvis. It focused on the negative aspects and ignored his contributions to music and culture. A whole generation grew up with a distorted view of Elvis, thinking he was just a drug addict. Geraldo Rivera later admitted that the show was one of the highest rated in 2020's history, but it didn't tell the whole story. Everyone who knew Elvis was baffled by his death. For those close to him, it was especially hard to figure out what really happened. They had seen times when Elvis took more medication than he should, but most didn't know the full extent of his health problems. They didn't understand how his pain, insomnia, and constipation led to the medications he took. They also didn't know much about his family's health history or how it affected him. One of Elvis's friends, Lamar Fike, said, "Elvis fell forward and suffocated, simple as that, but he didn't have any proof to back that up." Elvis's cousin, Billy Smith, said a toxicologist told him that codeine alone could have killed Elvis. Elvis knew he was allergic to codeine, and it made him itch. Dr. Nick, Elvis's doctor, confirmed this. Codeine made him itch, so he didn't like to take it, Dr. Nick said. But Elvis still took it sometimes, and it never killed him before. There were even 2 prescriptions for codeine in a private collection from 1967. During Elvis's autopsy, they looked for signs of an allergic reaction, like swelling in his throat, but they found nothing. So, the idea that Elvis died from a codeine allergy doesn't hold up. Dr. Nick also said that a person who dies from a codeine overdose usually goes into a coma first. Elvis died suddenly, which means it wasn't from codeine. Dr. Nick didn't even prescribe the codeine. It was given to Elvis by his dentist the night before he died. The other medications Elvis took in the last 24 hours before he died were given by Dr. Nick. These were pre-packed doses that Elvis couldn't change. They were for his sleep, colon, and blood pressure. Dr. Nick said he had been taking the same medications every day and was alive, so that combination didn't suddenly kill him. In 1994, the Tennessee Department of Health asked Dr. Joseph Davis, a famous medical examiner, to investigate if Dr. Jerry Francisco, who signed Elvis's death certificate, had lied. Dr. Davis concluded that Elvis did die of a heart attack, and Dr. Francisco was right. Dr. Davis said, if it had been a drug overdose, Elvis would have slipped into a deep sleep and tried to get help, but he died suddenly, which means it was a heart attack. A panel of toxicologists agreed that Elvis died from a heart attack, not from drugs. One of them, Dr. Kevin Marijan, said, the drugs in Elvis's system were all sedatives. They would have made him very sleepy, but they wouldn't have caused a sudden heart attack. However, no one ever considered genetic diseases as a cause of Elvis's death. In 2014, Dr. Richard Shepard, a forensic pathologist, reviewed Elvis's case. He found that Elvis's heart was very enlarged, likely due to high blood pressure. Elvis's liver was also twice the size of a normal liver, which could have been due to his medication, poor diet, or heart problem. Dr. Shepard said, "When the liver stops working properly, it puts extra strain on the heart, making it work harder." Elvis's family had a history of heart problem. Both his father and grandfather died of heart disease. This suggests that heart trouble ran in the family. Dr. Shepard also noted that Elvis had a very enlarged colon, which would have been very uncomfortable. He believed that Elvis's death was likely caused by the Valsalva maneuver, which happens when you strain to have a bowel movement. This strain can cause a sudden change in blood flow, leading to a heart attack. Elvis's friend Dan Warlick suggested this idea back in 1991, but it was dismissed. Warlick said Elvis knew he was going to die. He felt the pain in his chest and tried to get help, but it was too late. Dr. Shepard agreed that the Valsalva maneuver was the most likely cause of Elvis's sudden heart attack. Elvis's colon was so large that it could have been a reservoir for toxins, leading to organ failure. Dr. Nick said Elvis was a walking time bomb. With so many health issues, he could have died at any moment. Elvis didn't want to be remembered as a drug addict. He loved his fans and never wanted to disappoint them. He often performed even when he was sick because he cared so much about his fans. He was only human, recalled his friend George Klein. When he was really sick, he still went on stage. He hated to let his fans down. Elvis's death was a complex mix of health issues, genetics, and a sudden event. It wasn't just one thing that caused his death, but a combination of factors that led to that tragic day. I remember the day I first started thinking about Elvis Presley in a different way. It wasn't just about the music or the fame. It was about the man behind it all. I realized that to understand Elvis, I needed to look at his whole life, not just the last moments. This book is the result of that journey. Elvis wasn't just a rock and roll superstar. He was a son, a husband, and a father. He was also a person who struggled with health issues from a very young age. These problems weren't just something he dealt with later in life. They were there from the start, passed down through his family. His colon issues and other health problems were a part of him from birth. Even when he looked perfectly healthy on screen, he was battling things that no one knew about. Elvis was driven by a deep desire to take care of his family and friends. He wanted to provide for them no matter what. This was a big part of who he was. When his cousin Donna brought her baby to visit, Elvis promised to give him a job when he turned 18. That's the kind of man Elvis was. He saw himself as a provider and protector. Despite his fame, Elvis had a lot of debt and almost no savings when he died. He couldn't afford to take a break, even if it meant risking his health. He was so focused on being Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, that he often ignored his own needs. Elvis was very private about his health issues. He didn't want anyone to see his weaknesses. He started taking prescription medications to hide these problems, which only made things worse over time. The medications helped him keep up with his demanding life, but they also led to addiction. This is how many people remember him, but it's only part of the story. People who knew Elvis well say he was a good guy, even if he had flaws like everyone else. He was generous and kind, and he loved his fans. He never felt sorry for himself, even when things were tough. He kept going no matter what. Elvis' legacy is more than just the music and the movies. He's still providing for his family and fans. His daughter, Lisa Marie, and her children still benefit from his work. Graceland, his home, is a place where fans can come together and remember him. Elvis also helps the cities of Tupelo and Memphis by bringing in tourists and creating jobs. There are no bad guys in this story. Everyone around Elvis, from his friends to his doctors, did what they thought was best. The Colonel, Dr. Nick, and the Memphis Mafia all played their roles. They were part of Elvis' life, and they all contributed to his story. Understanding Elvis' life and his struggles helps us see him in a new light. He wasn't just a larger-than-life figure. He was a human being with his own set of challenges. He was someone who did his best to be the man his parents raised him to be. even when it was hard. Elvis once said, "I look at myself strictly as a human being that has been very lucky, but whose life has blood running through my veins and it can be snuffed out in just a matter of seconds." He was right. He was lucky, and he achieved things that few people ever will. But he was also human, and his life ended too soon. This book is my way of telling Elvis' story more fully. It's about the man behind the legend, the one who struggled and succeeded, and who left a lasting impact on the world. I hope it helps you see Elvis in a new way, just as it helped me.